feminism that it prefers, a feminism that is foul-mouthed, that in fact accepts these categories, these insult categories as its own, that is about two girls who run away from domestic protection and safety in search of risk, danger, and excitement in New York City's Times Square. And here's our epigraph. Patti Smith, who was completely influenced by Blake, is saying pretty much the same thing. Should I pursue a path so twisted? Should I crawl defeated and gifted? And this is from Pissing in the River, which is the anthemic song and the climax of the film. Now, this is a film that's very hard to get a hold of. I don't have the anthemic moment, but I have 3 other clips that I can show you to give you a sense of what this film is. And also just to remind you of how radical it is to have a queer film that is organized not around 2 full adult, 20-something women, but 2 girls who are on the run from the police, from the family, and one of the girls, her father is running for office for mayor of New York City on the platform of gentrification. And she deeply disagrees with her father's desire to clean up Times Square and joins forces with this street rat, kind of butchy street rat kid, and they meet in a psychiatric hospital where they both been placed because their rebelliousness has been cast as just part of their trauma. They need therapy, they don't need revolution, and they say, Fanon style, no, we want revolution. And they take the Ramones, I want to be sedated, and break free of the hospital. And that's where the film begins. It was a film that was produced in 1979, 1980. It's at the end of the Hays Production Code era. But really unlike any of the films that came out around that time. Remember John Sayles' Leanna, Desert of the Heart, made from the Jane Rule book. These were films that were really about, respectable white women who come to lesbianism, or personal best, come to lesbianism and realize a better world. This is a really, really different film. It coincides with the rise of punk, and with the beginning of this project to clean up New York City. And the girls, their interest in punk, their desire to rebel, they call themselves the Sleaze Sisters, and they form a punk band, flies in the face of a politics of respectability that the other films of that era are deeply interested in cultivating. I want to show you 3 clips. The first clip reminds you that 1970s, 1980s film is really, really different from contemporary film. It's long form, you get long, drawn out sequences that are just scenes. They're not for anything. This is a scene where we just see Nikki and Pammy wandering through Times Square. We get a sense of the flavor of Times Square before it was cleaned up by Giuliani, which is already super interesting. It's the Times Square that Sam Delaney talks about, Times Square Red, Times Square Blue. It's a Times Square that gay men romanticize in terms of the cruising and the piers that you find in David Wojnarowicz's work, but it's the Times Square as accessed and seen by young girls, not by gay male hustlers and cruisers. So it's a really, really different perspective on Times Square. Let me tell you why the film was never circulated. It was made by Alan Moyle, who went on to make another film, also about radio and music, with starring Christian Slater, Pump Up the Volume, which is also a rebel film. But this film originally had a sex scene in it between the 2 girls that established their status as a couple. The studio felt in 1979 that their audiences could not tolerate a sex scene between 2 young girls, and they took it out. Moyle was so mad that he walked, and he left the film to fend for itself. The studio put it out there. Idiots like Janet Maslin reviewed it and said that it was dreadful, okay? Whereas Playboy gave it 2 bunnies, so I'm reading Playboy film reviews now. He got 2 bunnies from Playboy, and Janet Maslin was like, this is a pathetic film, don't even go see it. The soundtrack's good, but it's dreadful. Just the 3 clips I show you, I think, will give you a sense of the energy and the excitement of the film. It went to a few gay and lesbian film festivals, disappeared from view, and still there are only 2 35mm copies of it. It does not circulate, people do not know about it, and I think that it's a shame, especially given Riot Girl and girl power and all of this stuff that we're interested in, but it's also because it refers to an expired version of queer activism and feminism, one, however, that I believe on our twisted path we should get back to. Hey!
Makes sense.
No sense makes
The
sense.
Slave Sisters.
That's their motto.
Did you write this? No. Then somebody's taking our name.
Maybe somebody wants to be like us.
Yeah, it's like destiny, man. More Slave Sisters.
Okay, so that's a great little scene at the end there. No sense makes sense, which is like a situationist or punk kind of ethos. They call the Sleaze Sisters. And then Nikki draws a mask on Pammy's face, which we know masking is a very popular kind of political tool. The Zapatistas used it, Anonymous uses it, the Occupy movement now uses it. It's as if to say, okay, we can all be Sleaze Sisters. It's not just the two of us. This is a movement. It becomes a movement in that moment. Okay, just to take you through. They're not like, oh, that's so bad. You know, the House of Psychotic Women, they're sort of embracing this idea. Yeah, we're psychotic. That's exactly what it is. We're crazy. We're out there. We're kind of going for it. At one point, Pammy starts dancing in one of the sex clubs, and you see her dancing to Walk on the Wild Side. There isn't a distancing of themselves from the street culture of pimps and prostitution. There's a sense that this is where we are safe, rather than in the domestic prisons that our parents have built for us. We would rather be on the street. These are the people we want to be around. It came out the same year as Cruising, and you remember LGBT groups protested Cruising, and that's why you still know about Cruising, because it was protested. It's still a thing. It's still a film. We still watch it. We teach it. We talk about it. Because Times Square wasn't protested, no one actually knows about it. And you'll know that now it's come back around because James Franco is trying to restore the sex scenes that were taken out of Cruising. My hope is that he does not get to Times Square and think he should restore the sex scene there too. Like, leave it to someone else, James. The politics that the girls engage in is basically part of a scenario, a scene in New York that leads to the Lesbian Avengers. Do you remember the Lesbian Avengers? They were a sort of offshoot of ACT UP. And a really different kind of feminism than the cultural feminism of the late 70s. The Lesbian Avengers motto was we recruit, which is exactly what the Sleaze Sisters do. And they used to go to schools. This is at a time when the Christian right was saying that gays and lesbians were recruiting new blood from young kids. And the Lesbian Avengers were like, what a great idea. We don't reproduce ourselves. We gotta do something. So they went to schools and handed out balloons to kids coming out. Little 4-year-olds were like, look, Mommy, Lesbian Avenger balloon. So this was like a really ludic politics of ACT UP. Not this puritanical buttoned-up politics of I don't like this representation, I don't want that representation. I'm going to talk. I'm going to turn the sound down and just play this in the background. This is a sort of utopian scene that I would talk about. The two girls have made a home in Pier 56, which is now part of that whole new waterfront development in New York City. Hudson, the piers are now like, I don't know, Chelsea Piers Sports Club and so on. But for them, this is a place where they can have a life, and they make a home in there from salvaged furniture that they find all around the city in the dumpsters and so on. And then Nikki lays out for them a kind of utopian project where she says to Pammy, you know, whenever you're in trouble, you have to call my name.
So you watch this.
And this, we have a little blood sister scene that you could not have in the post-AIDS
Don't
era.
worry, I never heard
Do you remember when
do
people
that.
used to do that when you were little? You don't do it anymore probably,
That's right.
but... And this is really the sex scene.
You like freaking? You get panicky, shaky? I want you to call my name. Just screaming. Scream as loud as you can. You know, like this. Pammy! Pammy! Nikki! Louder. Nikki! Pammy! Nikki! Pammy! Nikki! Pammy!
So it's kind of a beautiful scene. I think Alan Moyle was wrong in a way to abandon the film, saying that the sex had been taken out of it. I mean, it's a beautiful little scene of recognition that the two girls give each other, but they're also screaming each other's names, and the city is reverberating with their names. The final clip that I want to show by way of conclusion is they finally make it to a radio station run by a DJ, the creepy Tim Curry, who has discovered the Sleaze Sisters, and he invites them in to play a song. So this is a song that they play to tell Pammy's father, the mayoral candidate, to back off, but also to place themselves not within a group of lesbians. You know, they're not like, hey, we're lesbians, we're looking for other lesbians. They place themselves within a community of the dispossessed. And the way that that community is named is through a history of slang.
Yes, Father dear. You want to make Times Square as cold as your icy eyes? Why do you want to punish people who aren't like you? You know, at home I heard you use these following words. Thick, nigger, faggot, psycho. Well, I just want you to know your daughter is one. Thick, nigger, faggot, oh, your daughter is one.
Doctor's a man, cold heart holy man. You don't know anything about what makes me tick. All you know about is sucking up to important people, right? Oh yeah, forget you. Who do you think you're kidding with that shitty smile of yours? You know what? Your bedside manner makes me whoop my cookie. Give me a pop, man.
Nigga, faggot, oh, your daughter is one.
Asshole, your time has come. 'Cause I'm a time bomb. I'm gonna throw all over you.
Nigga, faggot, oh, your daughter is one.
Okay, so you could place this film right alongside another film that came out the same year, Born in Flames, and you could create this completely punk, feminist, queer past that has a completely different relationship to language, to rebellion, a different idiom of revolt than the one that we're trading in with trigger warnings, trauma, and the sort of, you know, the therapeutic climate that we're creating. So I'd ask you to think about this, think about the possibility that lessons could come from the past, that something better could have preceded us, and think ahead to what we want to do with our potentiality for rebellion and transformation. Thanks.
We do have time for some questions. questions? Would anybody like to ask one?
This is your chance.
This is your chance.
Yeah, seriously, bring it. Let's hear it. Okay, let's start with that.
You said that you only have 3 coats of this, but is there any way to see the more?
Yeah, you can buy the video.
Oh, you can?
You can buy the video on Amazon for $90. That's what I'm telling you. This is the best queer film I've seen. It really, really is. And notice, you can't tell from the clips that I showed you because they're grabbed from YouTube. High production values. Remember, it's by the producers who made Saturday Night Fever. This is not something that someone made in their basement. This was made for, you know, a lot of money at the time. It was made on the same kind of budget. They had to buy all the music rights, for God's sake. Talking Heads, Ramones. I mean, this was high production. And it's amazing how quickly the studio abandoned the film. It's also amazing to me how quickly gay and lesbian audiences, who were the target audience in the film festivals, which is where I saw it originally, also quickly abandoned the film. So Jenny Olsen showed it the year I was in grad school in Minnesota. She brought it, and she bought one of the 35mm reels, and that's the only reason I know about it is because of her curatorial genius of recognizing that this was an amazing film and holding on to it. And it was probably because she bought that reel that a DVD version even ever came out. Yeah. Yeah.
Can I ask a question? Oh gosh. One of the things I think I heard you say about triggers in the beginning is that they're negative. They have negative potential to kind of flatten pain and say this pain deserves a trigger and this might not.
Right.
But this clip with Your Daughter Is One, where the young white girl uses the N-word and then says your daughter is one, I'm just confused about, is that clip saying that like a white person has access to that kind of pain, or is that, what are we getting out of this clip?
Right.
Your daughter is one, and trying to belong to communities where we don't.
But okay, remember again, 1979, 1980, okay? Now, one little piece that I missed out is asking you to think about this film through some of the historical research that's been done recently by Christina Hanhart's award-winning book, Safe Space. Does anyone know Safe Space? Sounds like it's a book about, you know, the activist struggle for safe space. It's not. It's a critique of safe space rhetoric. And she did really, really heavy-duty research, oral history as well as archival research in San Francisco, LA, and New York. And what she discovered was that in the 1970s, the gay liberation movement and various queer and feminist groups had a very big project for social change that involved solidarity with anti-poverty and anti-racist groups. And she charts this and she shows all the different correspondences between the groups. Now, what she argues is that in and around the early 80s, there was a new push towards the gentrification in New York, in San Francisco, which is what this film's documenting, in LA. And white gay and lesbian communities decided on anti-violence campaigns instead of solidarity campaigns, okay? So they gave up fighting with groups that were organized in neighborhoods around anti-poverty and anti-racism, gave that up on behalf of setting up violence hotlines so that gay, lesbian, and trans people could report when they had been attacked. Now, who was doing the attacking, supposedly? The very communities they were reporting on the communities they had previously been in solidarity with. So when white, gay, lesbian, trans people asked for more policing, a lot of times communities of color and poor communities experience more policing than they did in the past. And this corresponds to the gentrification in the Castro and around the country. If anyone's seen the film Flag Wars by the woman who made Citizen 4, Flag Wars documents the struggle between an African-American community in Columbus, Ohio, that lived in this one neighborhood, and a wave of gentrification by white gays and lesbians that drove that community out. The Western Addition in San Francisco, 1985, was all black. By 1990, it was a white gay male community. So white gays and lesbians, really because of neoliberalism, because of the flow of capital, decided to go the anti-violence route and give up on a solidarity that in 1980 would have been recognizable. Not that white girls are saying, I'm an N-word, but that white girls are saying, you know how you say, Father dear, that you say, you use all these words as if these communities are disgusting to you, and they're marginal, and you want nothing to do with them? What if your daughter is one? I make common cause with the dispossessed. Not because I'm dispossessed, but because that's where I want to put my energies. That solidarity would have been recognizable in 1980, and today, how does it come back up for us? Gosh, should she be saying that word? There you have it. So the paradigm has changed, and I'm not saying she should say that word. I'm saying this would not have seemed like a weird thing to do. This was a film for general consumption. And therefore the politics around these slang terminologies was different then. So we're looking at a different paradigm, and we need to recognize what the difference is politically. Does that make
Is that
sense?
related to what you're saying about co-experience?
Yeah, the politics of the 60s and 70s was not as organized by discrete identities as it is now. There was a general sense that things must change, and that, even the film that just came out, Selma, was trying to say, hey, this was not just black against white. The director was critiqued for making it into black against white. No, she didn't. No, she didn't. She showed that there was a lot of solidarity coming, not enough, but it was there, that these were solidarity movements, that the civil rights was about broad-scale protest through different groups who recognized that the government and the law was wrong. Now what happens? Discrete, individualized identity groups say this is wrong, and not I'm critiquing the law, I want the law to come and save me and protect me. This is critiqued in Chandan Reddy's book, Freedom with Violence, where he says, white communities are saying, yes, I want freedom, but I'm willing to trade in order to be protected by the police, I'm willing to look away from police violence against communities of color, because I want my gated community to feel safe. So even though, I had a friend when I lived in San Diego who lived in a gated community, a black woman, when her brother came to visit her, he was arrested time after time. Why is this guy in the gated community? The white residents decide it's okay that the police in that gated community stop people of color who come in because they want to feel safe. Do you see what I mean? So Reddy's point is that there are all kinds of communities that are set up with a tacit agreement that we will give up a little bit of our civil rights. I mean, that was actually the premise of the Patriot Act, so it's not that difficult to recognize what he's talking about, in order to feel protected. But that then increases the policing of communities of color, which then comes back around, as we've seen recently, so that you get extreme violence and surveillance of communities of color. Okay? Yeah.
I'm curious about the first time you decided about halfway through your talk to not say the word nigger, and how you situate that decision in the arguments that you've made in the talk.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm going to go with the protocols of the day. Basically, that's how I'm deciding it. The protocols of the day are that, one doesn't use that word lightly, that it's seen as, being a word that white people shouldn't use, that there are particular conditions and circumstances within which people say it to each other, but that it's a part of some kind of vernacular. And so I'm going with the present tense, customary usage rather than the usage in the 1980s. But I am trying to point to how different the usage would have been then, but also how the word appears within a pantheon of other words. And had queer been a common word at that point, queer would have been in there too. And it's not just the N-word, it's the N-word, there's, spic, and these are words that are freighted differently. They're not all the same. Even though the way in which it's performed by these girls makes it sound as if these are all interchangeable words, clearly we now, and maybe even then, don't think that they are simply interchangeable. I mean, what are you thinking there?
Well, I'm wondering then if the choice that you make is then complicit in what you say the work around triggers does.
Yeah.
Trigger warnings.
Yeah. I mean, I think that this is part of the problem with making people feel squeamish about words. And I'm not saying that, African American communities shouldn't have made us feel bad about the use of this word. The word is, but the history of African American communities is quite different from the history of lesbian communities, say, who are reckoning with the word dyke. It's a very different history, and it doesn't have that same sense of sort of institutionalized, widespread violence that the N-word has. So I'm still trying to mark a difference. Maybe that maybe you're right. Maybe it is complicit. But one is always part of a language community, and I'm saying that the trigger warning stuff, however, is enforcing a particular kind of language use that is not necessarily common and widespread. Yes, at the back, and then we'll come here, okay? Yeah.
Is that me?
Yeah.
So, I'm kind of the same way you're saying. I'm kind of putting it into religion. A lot of the people here that I've talked with are saying how, well, I didn't agree to, but how back in the day, in history, the queer movement was not about, gay marriage, and now it's all about gay marriage. And somehow, in some way, it got twisted, and now it's not where it's supposed to be. But I kind of see that as how this is what's happening, as you're saying. So my question is, what do you think caused that to happen? Where did that just shift go? Like, what caused that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Okay, so there's a lot of critique that we've sort of sold out on the gay marriage front, that activism has been defanged, that what was really vital in ACT UP and really vital in the gay liberation front is somehow missing in contemporary struggles to simply get married, right? Why? Where has that come from? There are simple answers and there are complicated answers. The simple answer would be that a lot of activist groups who are, made marriage into their goal, made a lot of money doing that. Their HRC and I can't even remember the name of the group at UCLA. These are activist groups that wealthy gay men were willing to put huge amounts of money into. If you want to know why the marriage initiative passed, it passed because it had the right kind of backing, and that backing has to be monetary on some level. So that's sort of the short answer. The long answer probably has to do with neoliberalism. The story told in Chin and Reddy's book is probably the best version of this, or in Christine Hanhart's book. But what I'm encouraged by is that there is this whole set of books that have come out recently that are explaining exactly how neoliberalism works to make marriage seem as if it is the ultimate activist goal, when in fact it is the place where all of the energy and vitality of an activist cause has been drained out of it. Because, back in the 1970s, the Gay Liberation Front, they were not arguing for marriage, for God's sake. That was seen as being a very unimaginative social form that people wanted to push back on. How it became the cause célèbre and the journey that we were on, and has been achieved, that was achieved, by the way, in the same month that the Supreme Court pushed back on the voting rights bill, and those two things should, as many people have said, should be seen together. So I don't have a quick answer on that.
That's good.
Yeah, okay. So the guy back there, and then up here. Yeah. No? Yeah, you? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thanks. So I want to sort of latch on to the question about the N-word. And I'm sure you've gotten this question before. You did choose to say the word tranny, and I know that some people...
Oh yeah, I'm going to keep saying tranny.
Including Julia Serrano, I think, in response to your post, argue that that has a different meaning for trans women. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Depends what trans women. I could say to you that Vivian Bond, who's a trans woman, says it doesn't. So we can't have individuals tell us trans women don't like that term. Justin Vivian Bond and Julia Serrano got into an argument about that. Justin Vivian Bond was boycotted by people for saying, that's a word I like. I want people to say tranny, right? So it can't come down to one individual speaking for everybody. Is there a difference, though, your question is, between trans women and trans men using that term? It depends on the generation. The generation that started using that term goes way back into the 60s. The term tranny precedes the revitalization of words like dyke and faggot that are relatively recent and accompanied the move towards saying queer. Tranny is a very, very old historic word. And I think to turn a word like tranny into, even the word, it doesn't sound violent, tranny, to me. Violent, it sounds endearing, to turn that word into something that must not be spoken, and to call a club T-Shack, I don't know, That to me really, really smacks of censorship.
I think, I think my question was more along the lines of your decision to sort of observe some people's call for white people not to use this word, and not to observe some people's call for non-trans women
Right.
to not use this other word.
To say that all of these distinctions are not equal. People's histories are not equal. People's relationship to abuse is not equal. Now, yes, you're right. One can't. I'm arguing, not legislating this one person at a time, but the categories themselves that we're talking about have different histories. But you know, if people, when I hear the N-word in a rap song, I mean that I'm not protesting. You know, I'm saying the same thing about that word that I'm saying about these other words that are cast as slang terms, that we should be careful about how we use them.
So I'm on board with your viewpoints about triggers. I agree with it. My question is, as a young academic who's wanting to teach at a liberal arts school, is that really a viable, I guess, point of view to have in an interview setting? You know what I mean? I know that seems like sort of practical, but if my name is Jack Halberstam, I think I could probably get a job with this. But I'm pretty certain that it would be discounted.
That's such a good question. I have a student, a grad student, who I had just gone to Smith to do a talk, and I was doing a talk, it's similar to the talk I'm going to give tomorrow about the state of queer studies, and I gave it with my collaborator Lisa Lowe, because we run a book series together, and we were talking about the books in our series and so on. And so we gave a long talk about these different avenues of queer studies, post-colonial, anti-colonial, you know, queer black studies, et cetera, et cetera. First question, do you think that trans women should be allowed into women's colleges? And I'm like, oh wow, what about what I presented? Maybe ask me that question. Like, where did that come from? You know, that was the entire discussion was about that. So I went back to LA, and my student was going out to Smith to give a job talk. And I was like, I don't know what to tell you, but that's going to be at least one of the questions. Well, she has a better personality than I do, because I could tell she was going to be able to manage this. And it's partly, you have to figure out, you know, how to not be offensive while pushing back on the idea that in an elite liberal arts women's college, the most pressing question is whether transgender women can be admitted, when you look around and all you see are white people in those colleges, right? So why are they not as exercised about diversity issues at Wellesley and at Smith? Why are they so exercised about whether trans women can come in? I mean, to me that's simple. If you identify as a woman and you want to go to a women's college, go to a women's college. Like, that's like a 10-minute debate, really. But this thing is now the New York Times, the New Yorker, the New Atlantic, the New everything. It's like, can trans women go to women's colleges? Short answer, yes. Long answer, yes. There are other things to argue about in elite women's colleges, and I think that there has to be a generation of professors who are going to just say that and not be afraid by the mob of students who are like, you know, really, really pent up about this. But I gave a talk at Hampshire College, and I was being boycotted there because of my trigger warning stuff. So when I got there, I said to my host, I said, you know, boycott, what do you think is going to happen? He said, it's two trans guys. I'm like, oh, okay. So the two trans guys did not come to the talk, and nothing happened. We had a great discussion. And then this young trans guy came up afterwards, and we were talking, we were very, you know, had a really nice conversation. And I said, Sam, tell me, what's the boycott thing about? You know, and he said, well, I said, why are you guys all upset? Why do you all feel, why is every single person focused on, you know, the trauma, the sadness, the triggering, etc.? And he said, well, you know, your generation taught us that gays, lesbians, and trans people basically had been oppressed, marginalized, beaten, you know, trashed, and we believe you, and it may not have happened to us, but we have inherited that version of gay, lesbian, trans history. And so he said, and some of us have had bad things happen to us, but maybe not systemically, but we're still in that paradigm. And I was like, thank you. Thank frick you for explaining that to me. I do get it. I really do. And I do think this is not a generational war. This is a situation where things change. And when you don't, remember where I began, where I said there are people who teach the same things year after year, and they are not the good teachers? Things change, paradigms change, the world changes, and you do have to change how you talk about things. So let me give you an example, and I can talk about this more tomorrow. Beatriz Preciado's book, Paul Preciado now, Testo Junkie. That's a brilliant book, only just translated into English, even though it's been out 8 years. And it's this like wild ride of a person in a female body who takes testosterone and has incredible insights into the pharmaceutical industry and the regulation of identities, as he puts it, at the molecular level, rather than just at the fleshly identitarian level that changes everything. So we have to keep reading, we have to keep thinking, and we can't just say, okay, but Butler said, well, they never said any of these things anyway, so we have to keep moving. You have to keep moving intellectually, be more supple, more nimble, keep going, don't get stuck in a paradigm from another generation, or else you're talking about a world that doesn't exist anymore. So that's my feeling, is like, let's move on. Yes?
I'm thinking about your quest to sort of enter intellectual adventures, right? And
Yes.
this idea that by not establishing that sort of initial trigger warning in class, of course you permit a space of dialogue and of a discourse that can actually permit for us to look at these dolorous pasts, right? To look at the wounds, to look at these spaces of pain, and where the pain might be a sort of can give us access to historical consciousness, right?
Yeah.
Because by the mere idea of silencing these words, by not understanding the way that they've entered the economy of science, their significations, etc., and how that can actually be damaging, of course, because we're not confronting.
Yeah.
We're engaging really, again, just like our communities have continually sort of been silenced. We're engaging in that sort of continuing to leave it at the periphery, sort of at the abject. So I wonder how we can look at it as a sort of constructive space,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Instead.
Yeah, I like that formulation, Jimena. That sounds exactly right. Like, let's not just like go at each other, say you're wrong and you're wrong, but exactly see this moment as instructive about a different direction, that we want to go with this material. That feels exciting and feels like it sort of releases something for me. But did nobody want to make the argument? Well, I know we're going to finish in a moment. So does anyone want to, just totally like rip into me about this?
Should we just pull up Facebook? I feel like.
Yeah, just go for it. Yeah.
Could I just ask you, I know you must be exhausted and you're great, but I just want to ask you to say one thing about, I'd like to know what you say to students who contest the distinction between the representation of the trigger and the trigger. Because I think, speaking as a literature professor, the power of the novel or the fiction and what moves students is the representation. And so before they're able critically to distance themselves and talk about structure, characterological issues, etc., they respond empathetically.
Sure.
And so what do you say to people who say, you know what, it's not just the alarm, but it's the representation of the alarm. And that's my physiological response, and they are the same.
I say, but remember what we're doing in this class. We're recognizing that representation shapes reality. This is not a mirror held up to nature. And one of the examples I use a lot is Septimus Smith in Mrs. Dalloway. Septimus Smith is a great example of he's a wounded war veteran. He's come home from World War I, and his big question, is like, oh my God, all the trauma I've seen, and I come back and everything's the same, and people are just like going about their everyday lives. Why did I endure this for this nonsense world? Nothing seems worth what he has suffered. But that's not what triggers. What triggers him, therefore, is the banality of everyday life, the birds singing, the birds singing. It's always about the birds, and a line from Shakespeare triggers him, let not the heat of the sun, blah, blah, blah. So this is, to me, one of the best representations of shell shock, but also a very clear, rendering of the complexity of inner life, right? That's why we go to Virginia Woolf, because she's able to capture the weirdness of interiority and the way in which, even though interiority is processing the external, it doesn't do it by simply remapping the internal with the external. There are huge distinctions. We rarely are teaching something where it's just like, oh wow, that description of rape really, that really set me off, because the rape will be often distorted through a critical or representational lens too. Literature is not, it's not mimetic, and that's part of what we're always trying to teach. So how we suddenly are in the realm where we're collapsing representation and reality, which by the way was the argument that Catherine McKinnon made about why pornography should be a civil rights violation, because for her, pornography was the same essentially as rape, and there was a whole version of feminism that coalesced around that was deeply damaging to the way in which we understood sexuality, relations between men and women, thinking about the way in which we want to represent sexually explicit material, and so on. And that's a totalitarian world that I don't want to live in, where people say that representation is the same thing as reality. And at the same time, I also believe that we should constantly be exposed to deeply discomforting material. Think of 12 Years a Slave, right? By Steve McQueen. One of the most difficult, there are lots of difficult scenes to watch in that film, but what distinguishes it, critics said, from other slavery films is that it absolutely vilifies white sadism. It doesn't spare you from seeing that slavery is part of a system that is organized, regulated, and set up by something that can only be called widespread white sadism. It isn't just, some people used other people to work. There's so many scenes in excess of that. When Northrop is hanging from the bough of a tree, but is not lynched. His feet are tiptoeing around on the ground. Now that is shot in a long 3 or 4 minute take, right? In order for you to feel the discomfort for just 2 or 3 minutes, and then imagine what it felt like to be somebody who's experiencing that for the whole of the day and the whole of the night, right? You are asked a lot, this is what, Bergson, Deleuze, so many film theorists have said that film is about duration. It isn't only about an idea that is well expressed. It's sometimes about pulling you through the experience of duration, because you have to actually, especially when it comes to carceral systems or when it comes to torturous systems, you have to remember that this happens over time. Not that it just happens in the way a film happens, something blows up, some damage is done to somebody. It doesn't happen in a minute. It might happen in hours, might happen in days or weeks, might happen in years. And it's only then that you sort of get jolted by the full effect of what the filmmaker is trying and failing to represent, right? So I feel like we have to be more complicated about representation. I do not want students in my class saying representation equals reality.
Okay, I think ending on representation is not mimetic is a beautiful place to end. Thank you so much for that. That's what we did. We're on the way out, everyone.